We usually think of classical music as a chronological relay race of unparalleled individuals. Bach passes the baton to Mozart, who passes it to Beethoven. We picture them alone in a room, wrestling masterpieces out of thin air. Modern economic data tells a different story. When researchers track the human capital of these composers, specifically looking at their teachers and mentorship networks, the data shows that a composer's prominence is directly tied to the educational environment they were born into. To understand who actually succeeded in classical music, we have to look past the standard timeline of stylistic eras. We have to map the evolution of their schools. This diagram maps a 1,200-year transition. The horizontal axis is time, the vertical is educational structure. Medieval and Renaissance training stays flat, tied to church networks. During the Baroque and Classical eras, it steps up to court employees, finally plateauing at formal, centralized conservatories. This trajectory looks like progress, but it forces us to ask a difficult question about the return on investment for a musical education. Did building these formal institutions actually democratize access for the public, or did it establish a gatekeeping mechanism that systematically filtered out who was allowed to succeed? In the earliest periods, there was no public music school. Training relied entirely on the Catholic Church, cloistered convents, or tightly guarded family networks where fathers taught their sons. This closed loop created highly localized, specific styles, mostly polyphonic and modal music meant for religious services. Because these environments were isolated from secular society, they occasionally functioned as safe havens. Women like the abbess Hildegard von Bingen were able to quietly thrive and compose without public scrutiny. The problem with this system was the friction. Knowledge transfer was incredibly slow. If a new technique was developed in a specific Italian cathedral, it stayed there until someone physically traveled to learn it. The trade-off here is zero scalability. If you lacked physical access to a specific geographic church hub, or you weren't born into a musical family lineage, entry into the field was virtually impossible. By the 1600s, popular tastes shifted. Secular instrumental music gained traction, moving the center of power away from the church. Composers were now funded by the aristocracy, working either as gig musicians for specific events or as contracted court servants. This influx of royal money produced massive historical outcomes. It funded the standardization of the orchestra, the birth of public concerts, and established tonal harmony as the mathematical foundation of Western music. Because wealth was concentrated in specific cities, so was the talent. Localized aristocratic funding created specific schools of thought, most notably the First Viennese School. But there is a harsh economic reality beneath the powdered wigs. Musicians were effectively property of the court. They possessed very little independent commercial power. The trade-off of the patronage era is total reliance on elite tastes. Your creative output and professional survival were dictated entirely by the wealthy individuals signing your checks. Independent success was incredibly volatile. In the 19th century, music education shifted away from royal courts and informal networks, moving into physical, formalized academic institutions. The primary benefit of the conservatory system was economic. It drastically lowered the cost of accessing musical instruction for the growing middle class. This chart maps distance from a conservatory against composer prominence. When a conservatory opens, prominence peaks for composers born within 50 kilometers. But a second line tracking female representation shows that as proximity increases, the fraction of female composers drops sharply. The mechanism behind this drop is severe, codified gatekeeping. Major institutions like the Paris Conservatory actively barred women from enrolling in composition classes. This created a paradox. Locked out of institutions, female composers actually acquired a higher quantity of private teachers than their male counterparts. Yet, having more teachers failed to close the gender gap. Societal norms meant male mentors often refused to invest their political capital in female students, heavily attenuating the return on investment for that education. The formal educational institutions of the 19th century elevated the baseline of musical training for the broader public, but they enacted rigid gatekeeping that throttled the educational ROI for female composers and marginalized groups. The standard history of classical music functions as a progression of the Western musical canon, a curated selection of works used to standardize the art form. 19th century academics intentionally constructed this canon. They sought to legitimize classical music using scientific history, framing these works as having absolute objective value. This created a closed feedback loop. The institutions defined the rules of greatness based exclusively on the works of the demographics they allowed inside. Relying on the formalized conservatory model successfully preserved a high standard of artistic excellence, but it came at the direct cost of systemically erasing marginalized demographics from the historical record. We can map the educational landscape modern practitioners face today. Church and court patronage systems sit in the top right, high barrier to entry, high bias. The conservatory model sits in the bottom right, a lower economic barrier but the highest level of bias. The figures defined as greats were the result of specific temporary structural overlaps, data points where institutional resources and individual talent aligned perfectly. For the modern practitioner, formal institutions and schools will guarantee you a baseline of technical quality and access to resources. Ultimately, the historical record shows that prominence depends on institutional proximity. Maximizing your educational ROI requires leveraging that institutional access while securing the high-level mentorship networks that have historically been the final barrier to entry.